This is a CNA podcast.
Just a quick heads up before we start, there are descriptions of violence in this podcast that may be uncomfortable for some people. Listener discretion is advised.
A couple found guilty of abusing their 5-year-old son has been sentenced to 27 years jail each. 28-year-old Rizwan Mega Abdul Rahman was also given the maximum 24 strokes of the cane. His wife, Azlin Arujuna, also 28, was given an additional year of jail in lieu of caning. Under the law, women cannot be caned. The boy suffered burns after being scalded with hot water and eventually died in 2016. He was also confined in a cage meant for their pet cat.
A young life tragically cut short at the hands of his own parents. A 5-year-old's death shocked the nation. As soon as the news broke, the reactions from the public came, fast and furious. And 2 words stood out: cruel and inhumane.
These people are inhumane. How could they be so cruel to a small boy?
I feel the pain reading this article, and I cannot comprehend how parents can do this to their own child.
These are really sick people who need to be locked up forever. How could anyone possibly be this cruel to their own child?
They found on the deceased, based on the autopsy report by the pathologist, there was 75% scalding injuries on his body. Scalp showed lacerations and a puncture wound. Face had lacerations and incised wound. The face also had puncture wound, and there were comminuted fractures of the nasal bones.
That's the investigating officer, Mahathir Muhammad, giving a summary of what happened to the 5-year-old boy in 2016. His calm listing of the boy's injuries does not fully portray the sheer terror the child endured for 3 painful months. The judge called it one of the most horrific cases of child abuse. Indeed, the court documents annex, which detailed the boy's injuries, makes for unbearable reading. Pinched with pliers, burnt with a heated metal spoon, beaten with a broom, and splashed with hot water from a flask until his skin turned white. Perhaps the most shocking thing about this case was that the 5-year-old was confined to a cat cage, barely able to fit him. For 3 months, the child suffered at the hands of his birth parents, Rizwan Mega Abdul Rahman and Azlin Arujuna. They were both just 24 when they were arrested. You are listening to a special CNA podcast called Boy in a Cage, and I am Nadira Zaidi. In this podcast, we want to understand the mind and behavior of an abuser. And the question we want answers to: how can anyone, especially a parent, be capable of such cruelty?
Hi, my name is Cindy. I am a director of Melrose Home, which is a residential care facility that is run by Children's Aid Society.
Cindy Ng has been a social worker, and the home she runs houses children who are neglected and abused by their families. And Cindy says she sees similarities with these children.
We do see that there are certain patterns that are quite common. The first is usually that they themselves were abused, or they were subjected to very severe adverse childhood experiences. This includes severe neglect, poverty, and drug abuse, and also being made to feel like they do not belong or they don't deserve any love.
It is important to stress that this doesn't mean parents themselves who are abused when young will always go on to abuse their children. But according to experts, the chances of that happening is high.
Not all children who are abused end up as abusers.
This is Dr Jaydip Sarkar, a forensic psychiatrist and psychotherapist based in Melbourne.
Rates of parental abuse of their own children is 6 times higher in those who have been abused themselves than those who haven't been. And for first-time mothers, that raise is 12 times, particularly if they're from lower socioeconomic parts of the society.
A 2018 study by the Ministry of Social and Family Development on over 400 children who came into the Child Protection Services reinforces Dr. Sarkar's view. Half of the children in that study were physically abused, and 1/3 of their caregivers were themselves abused as children. But back to Dr. Sarkar. As a forensic psychiatrist, he is often called on to assess perpetrators of violent crimes like rape and murder. In fact, our interview with him had to be postponed several times because of his work. For this case, Dr. Sarkar was called on to assess the dead boy's mother, Azlin. He starts by saying that his job is not to judge or demonize the people he meets. Instead, he wants to understand them.
My interest in such individuals starts not by asking, what did you do? Because all of that is already there by the time we go to see them, but by asking what was done to you, what has happened to you before this incident happened.
And he shares what he learned about Azlin.
Azlin herself experienced an extremely traumatic childhood. Her first 4 to 5 years, similar age as the victim, was spent with parents who were extremely violent. A father who would beat her, in her words, black and blue for no rhyme or reason. He spent a lot of his time dealing with sort of alcohol and drug problems, lots of time in prison. She often went without food or drinks for days sometimes.
And here is where it gets even more painful.
Her mother would also throw hot water on her. Now, she remembered one instance, but her grandmother said that there were other instances. But in some ways, the template for becoming a later abuser was probably laid out in those first few years.
Some of us may have heard of the term intergenerational trauma, where unresolved trauma cascades like a waterfall from one generation to another. Dr. Sarkar takes pains to explain that this is not applied uniformly. Some who go through abuse may have others around them who can mitigate the worst effects, like a kind grandmother or an aunt whom they can turn to. But in some cases, unfortunately, the damage seeps into their psyche. So it sits there, quietly seething, and then, like in Azlin and her husband's case, unfurls in full fury. A quick word about the husband, Rizwan. According to court documents, he was the one who began abusing the boy by pinching him with pliers. One of the judges said Rizwan introduced a culture of violence into the family.
There was extreme domestic violence in that relationship. She would be beaten for no reason. She was kicked in the abdomen during her pregnancies as part of the domestic violence that she experienced.
Then, there were other factors that made things worse for the boy. He was born when his parents were just teens. Without enough money, they fostered him out in an informal arrangement to a friend. For 4 years, he had a different life, where food was always available and he was not punished for talking back. Azlin found she could not control the child the way she could with the others. In the months leading up to his death, Azlin's only source of comfort, her grandmother, died, and Rizwan would disappear for weeks on end.
So it was like a tinderbox, and an explosion was bound to happen. Unfortunately, this ended in this little boy's death.
It seems almost impossible to understand how anyone would not walk away from so much pain. For most of us, the response is simple. You would say, "This hurts, help me." But Dr. Sarkar explains why trauma, so deeply embedded, can make it hard for victims to step out of its long shadow.
There is something else that happens with traumatized women like Azlin, that over years of being pummeled and beaten and abused and degraded, their sense of identity and self is like next to nothing. They cannot believe that they can survive on their own.
And that's also something Cindy sees with the families she works with.
A common misconception is that we learned violent behavior, and therefore we see it as the only way of life, and therefore we played it out. Human behavior is much more complicated than that. It's not a situation where, for example, if I learn to steal, then I will steal. A lot of the difficulties in traumatic experience is that it is a full sensory experience. So you see it, your body feels it, your nervous system processes it before you think it. So when trauma happened, your body feels it. And it feels it much faster, and your body reacts much faster than your brain can even think. So that's why we can see that it is not so easy to reverse.
For both Cindy and Dr. Sarkar, the little boy's painful death offers lessons for the living. For one, it should make us more discerning of those struggling with addictions.
So some of the key red flags are, again, not directly attributable to violence and abuse. Definitely is addiction. So it could be drug addiction, alcohol addiction. That's one common factor that we notice.
Another red flag, watch out for children who are not enrolled in school.
This boy, he was almost 5 when he died. He never went to school. Why is a boy in an affluent, economically developed country like Singapore isn't going to school?
And don't ignore cries or screams. Pay attention to things that seem a little unusual. Cindy and Dr. Sarkar also added that people who struggle often do so in shame and silence. But if someone, anyone, reached out to help, that itself can help save a life.
I work with parents of children who are abused because you can see that they need so much help. If it was extended much earlier, we could actually mitigate a lot of the effects much faster and might be able to prevent severe damage from happening.
This loss of life of this young child, if it goes some distance in helping create strategies and screening tools and processes that prevent such things from recurring again, he would have done his service to the society that he lived in.
This is a production of CNA Podcasts. This episode was written and produced by Crispina Robert, edited by Tiffany Ang. Our social media editor is Joanne Chan, assistant producer Jacqueline Chan, sound mixing by Kent Delbridge, and I am Nadira Zaidi.